So you've seen now the syntax for the standard for loop in C++. You can initialize some variable and you can give your loop a condition, so that way you can control how many times that you repeat the code in the for loop's body. But as you may see during the lab this week, it's really easy to write buggy code with errors called off by one errors, which is a type of error where you intended to write a loop to repeat code X number of times, but you're off by one. So in other words, you looped one time less than what you intended or one time too many. And this is a mistake that's very common and it's totally reasonable, especially since you might still be getting used to zero indexing. So in here we have an example of an off by one error where you might have started your initialization variable at 1 instead of 0. And because we have zero indexing and the first element is always accessed at the 0th index, you'd be accidentally skipping the first element within the digits vector with this for loop here. So, but I'll show you a different type of for loop, which you'll grow to appreciate because it makes our lives easier and we won't have to deal with indices like this standard for loop. And that type of for loop is called the ranged base loop. And the range based loops, what they are a specific type of loop that allows us to loop through, or in other words, iterate over elements in a given range. So the range could be some sequence of elements like the digits vector. And this for loop is really elegant because it makes sure that we iterate over all of the elements in the vector, and we don't need to deal with making a condition to compare some index with the size of the vector or increment that index. We just have to initialize some variable, like in this case digit, which will hold the value of the element, of each of the elements at each loop. And we also just specify the range of elements that we're iterating over. So in this case, we have a variable named digit, and at each iteration, or for every loop, that digits variable is going to be assigned an element in the digits vector. So we specify to the right of the colon the range, or the sequence of elements, which in this case is going to be a vector of ints, digits. And for every iteration, we read one at a time the digit within the digits vector and we'll assign it to the digit variable here. And then we can run all the lines of code that fall within the curly braces. So that code block gets repeated for every element within the digits vector. So every time that we iterate, we're going to assign digit to the element, so one of the elements within the digits int vector. And then we're going to run the block of code. And we'll keep on doing that for every element in the int vector. And every repetition or loop is called a single iteration. So this is a new piece of terminology that we'll start using now. So we're going to transition from talking about loops and just repeating code, and we're going to call it now iterating. So what the range-based loop does is iterate over a sequence of elements in the range that you pass in to the right of the colon. So in this case, what this loop does, it iterates through elements of the int vector called digits. So every time that this digit variable gets assigned some value, to one of the elements within the int vector digits, that would be called one iteration. And during that iteration, we will run the lines of code within the curly braces. So it might be easier for you to see this if we visualize it. So let's just look at the visualization for this range-based loop. So we have our digits vector. So we have the elements 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, and then the indices at the top. But notice that we aren't actually dealing with indices anymore with this loop. And that's kind of like why this loop is going to save you a lot of pain, because now what we're doing is just defining a variable digit, which is going to be directly assigned to the value of the element that we're at. So at the very beginning of the for loop, we're going to assign digit to the first element within the vector. So a digit is going to be 3, and then we can print that out. And then at the next iteration, we're going to assign digit to the next element, and we're going to print that out. We're going to print out 1. Then the next iteration, we'll print out the next element. Digit will be 4. Then we'll keep on going. Digit will be 1, and we'll print that out. and then digit will be 5, and we'll print that out. So after this is done, we don't need any condition to manually check if we're at the very last element in this vector. This range-based loop kind of does that for you under the hood. It knows that once we reach this final element, 5, there's no more elements left to iterate over. So the for loop will end here, and we're going to move on with whatever code that might fall after the closing curly brace here.